The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew.
Glory to you, Lord.
When the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a scholar of the law, tested him by asking, "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" He said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and the first commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. The whole law and the prophets depend on these two commandments." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
There is this field, you can imagine it. It's a few acres of land that looks pretty unimpressive. It has a mishmash of plants living there with no particular purpose and placed there with no particular intention. It's a pretty depressing field. It's one of those fields you drive by and you wonder who abandoned it, who ran out of money and couldn't keep it up any longer. But imagine that field gets purchased and it's handed over to a farmer who has the skill and the willingness to work it over and make some use of it. He knows what it's capable of, and he knows what's necessary to move it from being a wasteland for weeds to a fruitful field. The method that farmer would use to develop that field is the same method that we need in our own conversion, and it's laid out for us in our scriptures today. St. Paul is writing to the community of Thessalonica, which has struggled with afflictions. It was a city that was torn by strife. There was a large community of pagans there living alongside people following Judaism and Christianity. And so anyone really trying to live out their faith would have faced a severe amount of persecution. And yet the people of that community saw that it was important for them to witness to their faith. And so they bore their fair share of hardships and afflictions for the sake of giving testimony to how God was working in their midst. And this is, it seems to me, the first thing that has to happen to land in order to be fertile. It has to be disturbed. It has to be broken up. The farmer has to take a sharp blade and run it through the ground in order that something new can be opened up, a new space for a new seed that is to be given. And the same is true for us in our own experience of conversion. Something has to be troubled. We need a little affliction to kind of break ourselves open, to break open our stony hearts and to be willing to receive something new from the outside. But this disturbing of the soil through affliction is just the beginning of this process of conversion. The soil, we all know, also needs nutrients. It needs irrigation. It needs a way so that it can become more receptive to the seed that's given to it. And Jesus points this out in the gospel by saying the first and the greatest commandment is to love God with all your mind, with all your soul, and with all your heart. That is, everything within you has to be permeated by the presence of God. This is how we become fertile soil, by giving everything to the Lord, allowing Him to fill us with His presence so that we can welcome the grace that He gives to us each day. But if we're not developing our relationship with God, then the affliction that we talked about earlier just becomes a real burden. And then we start to complain. Not that you all would do this, but some people complain. They complain about work. They complain about relationships. They complain about the fact that they're sick. They complain that their circumstances aren't what they would like them to be. and we get caught up in this circle, this vicious cycle of complaining. But if we can trust that somehow God is working there, that God is working the soil of our hearts, that He's trying to break something loose so that He can plant something new, then maybe we can start to look at those difficulties a little differently. Maybe we start to ask, what's the value of me getting sick? What new thing is God trying to show me because of my struggles in a particular relationship? What values are given to me because of the circumstances that I have to deal with on a daily basis? And so there's this shift, a shift from complaining about what's happening to us to digging a little deeper and looking for how God might be using all of these things for the sake of our salvation. This certainty that God is working in the midst of it all helps us to not give up. It helps us to not give in to despair and let go of the field and just let anything grow that might happen to grow up within us. But the work doesn't stop here. We have to keep moving out of this fertile soil of a relationship with God. We're also called to love our brothers and sisters. Because if our love for God remains private, if it's just in our own minds and in our own hearts, then it has no impact on the world around us. It doesn't affect the way that we live with our family. It doesn't help us in the way that we interact with our friends and our coworkers. We need something that's going to move us, to help us to go outside of ourselves, to recognize the people that God's given to us. People will know what's growing within us only by the way that we respond to them. Only by the way that we care for them and reach out to them in their need. You know, in some ways, even in this church, that any place where there's an empty spot, it's like corn that hasn't been planted. There are rows and rows possible of a possibility here for discipleship. Plenty of people who can come and plant themselves where you are and next to you, that can grow in their own understanding and in their own knowledge of God. We're wasting the field that we've been given. There is plenty of space. The challenge for us is to recognize that there are people who in their hearts want to be here, who need to be here. There are people in this community who are longing for a place to belong, longing for a place where they can come and be nourished and strengthened on this path of faith. And if you don't believe me, just walk the streets all day. Walk the streets and look around and see who's walking beside you. There are people desperately longing for what we have, desperately longing to know that God loves them and that God cares for them and that God is searching for them. Those are potential disciples who can be here, who could be planted in these rows and allow our community to really flourish and to experience the goodness of God and how He's working among us. And if we do this, if we can reach out and invite our family and friends and those who are maybe have fallen away from the church, then we can begin to be a fruitful presence in our community and in our world. This is what happened to the Thessalonians. They were afflicted, they trusted in God, they loved the people around them, and they became this bold witness to the faith within their community and within the known world of Christianity. This field in which we live can be a real place of nourishment for others. But if we don't dig deep in our own relationship with God, if we're not willing to get our hands dirty in our relationship with God, then we can become like fake plants. You know, last winter I was driving around and I drove by a house. I hope it was not your house. But I was driving by a house and it was in the winter time and someone had dug holes in their yard and literally planted artificial plants in their yard. And of course, when the snow falls, you see this kind of these fake neon green plants sticking up out of the snow. We don't want to be fake plants. We don't want to be fake Christians. We are not here to decorate the world. We are here to be nourishment for the world, to feed those who are walking this path of faith and need something substantial that can help them to keep going. We're not called to be Christian decorators. We're called to be Christians who, by the way that we live, provide nourishment for others who are struggling to walk this Christian walk, this path of faith. And we can't do that if we're not willing to dig. We can't do that if we're not willing to really wrestle with our own relationship with God and consider where we are. And that means that we might have to ask some very difficult questions. Does God exist? Do we believe that He cares for us? Do we believe that it's possible to have a personal relationship with God? Do we believe that He cares about our lives? Do we believe that He's called us for a particular purpose in this life? We can't avoid these questions. And we're all at different places in our own relationship with God. But we have to wrestle with these things. If we're going to be real, if we're going to avoid being called hypocritical, then it means that we have to dig deep in our relationship with God. And in that wrestling with all of these questions, then maybe we can begin to understand our brothers and sisters who are also looking for this relationship. And then maybe we'll feel comfortable inviting them to this place to join us for worship. It's not that everybody who shows up here has to believe the same thing in the beginning. You know, we don't invite people here because they understand everything about the Catholic faith. If that were the case, I probably wouldn't be here. It's not about understanding everything in the beginning. It's about inviting people to be a part of who we are. Then we can begin to grow. Then we can begin to educate and to catechize and help us to grow in our own relationship and our own understanding of God. But we have to get people here first. And that means that we have to dig within our own hearts to really search for what our relationship with God looks like. And so the invitation today is to really dig deep in our relationship, to question where are we in our relationship with God? Who's He calling us to be? What's He calling us to do in this world? And once we can wrestle with those questions, then we can be a fruitful presence in our world, helping others to recognize that God truly loves us and that He is present and that He wants nothing than to be in a deep and profound relationship with each and every one of us.